I am Mike Makowski. I'm the okay. I am Mike Makowski. I'm the president CEO of GINSA, and thanks for joining us for this webinar on Britain's reaction to October 7th to the Israel-Hamas war. We're really honored to have two very interesting guests, and I think a lot of people are very interested in this subject based on the turnout. We have Joe Sternberg. He's a member of the Wall Street Journal's editorial board and the political economics columnist. He joined the journal in 2006 and as an editorial writer in Hong Kong. He is also author of The Theft of a Decade, How the Baby Boomers Stole the Millennials' Economic Future, examining the consequences of the Great Recession. He previously worked as a journalist in Washington, D.C., and he was raised in Vermont. And then we also have Jonathan Arkish. He's a barrister in London and a mediator specializing in property, commercial and probate law, and he is, among other things, the former president of the Board of Deputies, which maybe Jonathan could explain for American audience more, but is like a umbrella Jewish organization in England. Is that right, Jonathan? Did you say?
It's the representative body of British Jews, elected democratically. Every significant congregation and Jewish organization elects a representative. So it's Parliament, if you like, of the British Jewish community. And it was founded in 1760 and has acted as representative ever since.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad you filled that in for us. Joe, I'm going to start with you first. Obviously, there've been some political changes going on in London. It seems like connected to what's been going on, or that's impacting what's going on. But let's just start for a second. Bring everyone up to speed. How is the government in the UK responded to what happened on October 7th? It seems like, for instance, that the rhetoric initially from the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister initially very strongly supportive. I think the British Foreign Minister was the first Foreign Minister to visit Israel on October 11th. But how have you seen their rhetoric, and how have you seen what they've done?
Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this webinar. So I think this has, in terms of the government response specifically to events on the ground in Israel and Gaza and the way that the war has unfolded since the October 7th terrorist invasion. I mean, for better or worse, I think that the UK has often ended up following the path that you've seen in a lot of other Western countries, which was very strong initial support for Israel that was fueled by outrage at the barbarity of the October 7th attack, followed by this steady kind of watering down of the approach, which I think is created by a bunch of things. First off, the fact that the level of outrage or sheer surprise that people experienced on October 7th is not sustainable over long periods of time. And then also colored by the fact that the media in many parts of Europe often are particularly bad in the way that they cover these issues. And so I think that you have to always, politicians have to confront the fact that voters are often getting a very distorted view of what is actually happening over there. So I think that is kind of the broad setup for this. And then the other condition, though, that I think is going to be important to keep in mind in this chat is that we are expecting a general election at some point next year, certainly by January of 2025 at the latest. So I think that in terms of the domestic politics of these events within the UK, you can't separate it from the fact that there's also a state of political flux that was already in motion as both major parties gear up for that election campaign, and then also as British politics was grappling with factors like the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the economic factors like the cost of living or inflation crisis, and an energy price crisis. And so I think that sort of on top of all of those pre-existing factors, what happened on October 7th and the aftermath of it has, I think, set in motion a bunch of interesting parts within British politics that I suspect we're going to talk about for the rest of the webinar.
Michael, you're muted at the moment, so I can't hear you.
I apologize. Thank you very much. I said, actually, before I was going to turn to Jonathan, I had one follow-up for Joe. The labor leader, Starmer, seems to, who probably not many Americans are that familiar with. We got used to Corbyn for a while. Unfortunately, he's not the head of the party anymore, but he has been a consistent opponent, for instance, of the ceasefire, which has been one of the issues in this conflict that kind of defines where your position is. And I know he has faced a sort of, I don't know what you call it. Is it a rebellion or certainly sort of defiance within the Labor Party against that position, which is really more with the Israeli position. And I was just curious if you could explain, in your view, why about him and why you think he's taking this position.
Yeah, Mike, that has been, I think, one of the most interesting British political developments to come out of the situation. So as you pointed out, what has happened is the Labour Party leader, Keir Starmer, who is widely expected to become prime minister after the next election if the polls are right, has ended up facing a rebellion within his own party because he has refused to join calls for a ceasefire, although he has called for a humanitarian pause. And more than that, he has actually given a couple speeches where he has made very clear in a forceful way that he was not going to support calls for a ceasefire. And I think a couple factors might influence this. I mean, one is we shouldn't discount the possibility that he actually believes that, not supporting a ceasefire is the right thing to do. And he is a lawyer, and so one would hope that he understands some of the international law concepts that are thrown around so carelessly in connection to this conflict, and will understand who is on the right side of it and who is not. But I think that there's also a really interesting political factor here that might end up speaking well of the British electorate, which is that Starmer came in to do a cleanup job of all of the rot from the Corbyn era. I mean, both the political rot and also, frankly, the moral rot of a lot of Corbyn's far left positions on whether it was the anti-Semitism that he allowed into the Labour Party or his foreign policy issues, including one time referring to Hamas as friends. And so I think that Starmer has felt that this is a key test where he needs to prove to the electorate, all of those people who abandoned the Labour Party in the 2019 election that Corbyn lost so spectacularly. Starmer now feels that this is a moment where he needs to prove to those voters that they can safely vote for Labour again, without offending their principles or their sense of justice on some of these issues, particularly proving that the party is trying to leave behind the anti-Semitism of the Corbyn era.
Let me turn to Jonathan. Jonathan, would you want to address, please, how you view the reaction by the government and the Labor Party to what's been going on? And we'll talk about the domestic issues in a minute. I just mean the conflict.
So I agree with Joe about Sir Keir Starmer. I know him. I believe that he is indeed trying to demonstrate that he's a grown-up politician and can deal with real problems in a realistic way, despite the fact that that means he's having to face down elements in his party, including members of parliament, for constituencies with a large Muslim electorate. And he has faced them down. And I think he should be given credit for that, because it was not so obvious to me that he would do that as leader of the Labour Party. They have got rid of Corbyn, but they haven't expunged all the ghosts yet. There are still left of centre members of parliament and senior politicians in the Labour Party who served under Corbyn, as indeed Keir Starmer did. On the government, I would actually give the British government a little bit more credit. First of all, I think their policy is basically identical to that of the administration in the United States. I think their support for Israel, their revulsion of Hamas, is completely genuine. There will be a growing chorus of demands for Israel to dial down the bombing because of the humanitarian issues that play to an extent with people around the world, and British people are no different. Joe was right when he said that to an extent voters are not really given a completely accurate picture of what's going on if they just watch the BBC. The BBC's reportage is undoubtedly slanted.
Yeah.
Not always, and not always badly, but the slant is there. The turns of phrase, the pretty much uncritical acceptance of what Palestinian spokesmen say, coupled with anyone speaking for the Israeli side getting cross-examined and words are used like unverified. And that's a problem. But as Joe said, or you said, the Foreign Secretary visited Israel immediately, followed within days by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, followed last week by the new Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, who's a long-standing friend of Israel. And furthermore, the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, is now in charge of the Home Office. And he's already talking about passing new laws against some of the anti-Semitic outrages that I know you're going to ask me about, that we've seen on our streets in London. So I would regard our government as being a solid friend, which doesn't mean that they won't criticize and join in some of the pressure on Israel. I will just say one other thing. Britain, for better or for worse, no longer has to follow a joint foreign policy of the European Union, and it can take its own path. And I think you're seeing that, and you'll continue to see it.
Joe, do you want to address that last point that Jonathan just mentioned about the EU?
Sure. I mean, I think that this is one of those instances where it can cut both ways, because I think that, yeah, Jonathan is absolutely correct that Britain has a record of being more right than the European Union on a lot of foreign policy issues, including, often in the Middle East and Israel. I think that being outside of the EU and not being bound by the common foreign policy approach, in one sense, it does give the UK an opportunity to more fully express those qualities without being bound up in the EU negotiating apparatus. The only downside is that means that then you don't have that UK presence within the EU trying to shift them. So I find it a little difficult to draw a clear line to suggest that Britain being out of the EU has been clearly a good thing or clearly a bad thing in this case. But I do think that that is a factor, because this, along with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, are really the first major crises that both the EU and the UK have had to face when they were not part of the same bloc together.
And Britain led the way in opposition to the Russian invasion in a very powerful way And I
Yeah.
think that it would have been a bit inhibited if it's still part of the EU. And the truth is, I respond to Joe, when there was an EU foreign policy, mostly Britain was not successful in persuading France and Germany in particular to come around more to the British way of thinking.
Let me ask you about one thing, and then I wanted the anti-Semitism, but one last thing on this is, you mentioned David Cameron, so there was a reshuffle. Well, you, Jonathan, did, and so he visited already. So he's now the new foreign secretary, and you said he has a good record on Israel. When he was there, I guess he kind of echoed some of the talking points that U.S. officials have been making. I'll just mention one that I guess was notable when he went to Ramallah about a few days ago, I guess. He says, I met with the Israeli president, prime minister, and others. I stress over and over again, they must abide by the international humanitarian law, and that the number of casualties are too high, and they have that on top of, and that they have that on top of their minds. Now, it's not that the U.S. hasn't said that, but I guess it just seemed a little more emphasis here. And of course, he was in Ramallah when he said it, but I just want to know, since you mentioned Jonathan, you thought he was a good friend of Israel, maybe just address that.
He's a good friend of Israel. Years ago, he did once call Gaza a concentration camp, which didn't go down too well. But his overall record on Israel and his friendship is there, and we believe it's genuine. What he said in Ramallah last week is exactly the sort of thing you say when you go to Ramallah.
Yeah. Okay.
If you go to Ramallah and come out with a completely pro-Israel point of view, you're not going to get anyone to talk to you there. But and as you say, I don't think he said any different from what President Biden has been saying. And I wouldn't expect, I mean, it might be nice, but I wouldn't expect a British foreign secretary to be saying exactly the same thing as the board of deputies of British Jews or the Zionist Federation.
Okay.
They are going to introduce some more balance, whether they believe it or not, because like it or not, they have to retain credibility with the Arab world.
Yeah.
Mike, if I can just jump in with a quick point on that, I guess one thing that the essential backdrop here also is the sort of political swirling that's going on ahead of the election that we're expecting next year. And so from that perspective, I guess my view on the situation with now Lord Cameron is that it isn't so much whether they are going to have the right or the wrong instincts on the policy questions that they face, because I think oftentimes they do have the right instincts. I'm worried that we're just going to find that it will be an increasingly difficult environment politically for them to express those, because, I mean, remember, we have just had a major reshuffle of the cabinet. We've had a new foreign minister coming in. The fellow who was the foreign secretary before is now in a completely different and equally complicated job that has to address a lot of the domestic angles that I suspect we'll be talking about shortly. And that isn't necessarily going to be an environment that is always conducive to the degree of focus that we would want them to have. So part of it is going to be, do they have the right instincts on the merits? Part of it is going to be, is the political environment such that they can actually act on those in the way that we would want them to?
So let's move on to and we'll get back to, I want to talk about, as you mentioned, this shuffle with the Home Secretary Braverman being removed. But so let's talk about what prompted that. It seemed like on what's going on in the streets in London. Yesterday there was about, I think I saw reports around 100,000 or maybe less, I don't know, about 100,000 folks in London protesting the anti-Semitism, and this has been in response to what we see. It seems like every weekend, larger and larger marches in London. I think culminated, I think it was a week ago or 10 days ago, I guess it was, about what was estimated about 300,000 marchers. And I don't I don't consider these pro-Palestinian marches. They seem pro-Hamas marches. I'm not really sure the difference anymore. But Jonathan, how do you explain what's been going on in the streets? I mean, here across the pond, and we see this, and it's alarming. Is these mostly Muslims that are demonstrating? Are you surprised? We'll talk about the police reaction and so on also.
So, compared to the United States, Britain is a small country, and it's easy to get to London for a demonstration.
Good point.
Pretty much everywhere is within 2 or 3 hours, 4 hours max of London. We have a Muslim population in Britain of getting on for 4 million, out of a total population of 63 million, approximately. And it's rising. Against that, most of these marches there's been 3 or 4, had about 100,000. One was said to have 300,000. I think that was a pretty significant overestimate. British Muslims are in the main descended from Pakistani families. I know Muslim and their mosques and communities well. I invested a lot of time on behalf of the British Jewish community talking to them. Unlike Muslims in, say, France, which come from North Africa, where they lived by Jews, they knew about Jews, and they didn't always like them very much, and they felt a certain affinity with the Palestinian cause. Most British Muslims, while they're instinctively going to be pro-Palestinian because that's the social media ecosystem they live in, it's not a big part of their world picture. So, to my mind, and without in any sense being complacent, because we're not, getting 100,000 people on the streets, probably a half to 2/3 of whom are Muslim, is not such a big deal. They're usually younger. They're from a more extreme end of the Muslim community who are highly politicized. And I'm sorry to say, they carry an awful lot of anti-Semitic baggage with which they were brought up. And to some extent, as we've seen, they pick up in mosques. They're probably more religiously observant than most British Muslims, who in the main are not particularly observant and don't attend the mosque very often. On top of that, you've got the far left. Now, as you're seeing in the United States, and by the way, I would argue that the situation in the United States is extremely similar to what's happening in the UK. We're just getting there first. A bit like we did with anti-Israel stuff on campus that took some time to migrate to the United States. But boy, you've got it big time there. Worse, by the way, than anything I ever saw on a British campus. You've got this far left alliance with Islamists. Now, it's an extremely bizarre alliance because pretty much everything which the far left stands for is not allowed in an Islamic country. This is a very ugly alliance. It's a marriage of convenience, and it comes from the far left's ideological reference point. They don't like America. So Israel's a friend of America. So Israel is in the dock. They love attacking what they would call colonialists. And if you think this way, you can portray, if you're ignorant of history, Israel as a settler colonialist country. They can throw around allegations of apartheid, and they do. The truth is, and so many other things, that the talking points of the far left. We're not talking about the Labour Party. We're talking about groups like the Socialist Workers' Party. They are a left-wing fringe with a certain following amongst some either elderly people who I would describe as borderline deranged, like Corbyn's brother, Piers Corbyn, who rants complete nonsense. But mainly it's younger people who want to overthrow capitalism, smash capitalism. Their enemies are not particularly Israel, they're enemies of Great Britain. They're enemies of British values. They're enemies of the United States and America. They're enemies of Western liberal democratic values. Okay, so they get 100,000 people out in the street, and we'll no doubt talk in a minute about the sort of slogans they're chanting. But I want to point out that yesterday, the March of Solidarity with Jews against anti-Semitism brought out somewhere between, depends on which estimate you follow, 50,000 to 100,000 people on the street. I was there. There were so many people, I couldn't even begin to estimate the size of, I think 50,000 would be a low estimate, and 100,000 people is probably a high estimate, high-ish. Most of the people on that streets yesterday were Jewish, with a fair number of non-Jewish supporters. We have a Jewish community of only 300 to 350,000. So if a lot of people on the street yesterday were Jewish, that's a huge proportion of the British Jewish community. And they came out, but they got support from a cabinet minister who spoke at the rally. And you may have seen on your social media that the Prime Minister also spoke in support on social media and said he was proud to support that. So I'm not one who's going to get too hooked up on large marches by either side, except to point out the hate that is coming from the anti-Israel marches. And we'll no doubt talk about that a bit more.
I mean, let me, I guess your point, that's an important point you mentioned also about these relatively small amount of Jews in England compared to in the UK compared to here. And I mean, we had a march here in Washington, as you know, 2 weeks ago. It was estimated about a little under 300,000. You know, I don't know how many Jews there are exactly in this country. I've seen ranges, but if it's 5 million or 6 million or more, it's a much smaller percentage that came out on our march than did in London. I mean, and I don't believe the President of the United States, if I recall, actually spoke at the march here. I wasn't there. I was in Israel, but I don't think he did. So are you suggesting, because you said you think it's actually worse here, what you're seeing in some ways than what's going on in UK? Maybe just address that a little more. And we'll talk about the marches a little more about what the hatred.
Sure. Well, I know, because I dealt with it over many years, that the American Jewish community has an entirely natural and laudable concern for smaller Jewish communities, especially in Europe, because of memories of what happened in Europe in the Second World War. And I get that. But I have to tell you that when I led the Board of Deputies and I stepped down 5 years ago, and I got concerned phone calls from American Jewish organizations, I was saying to them 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, guys, are you looking about what's going on in your backyard? Because it seems to me to be serious and worsening. Well, I think we're now seeing it.
You said that on one of our webinars, actually. I remember.
Sorry?
You said it on one of our webinars, actually.
I think, oh, well, there you go. I'm on the record.
Yeah.
I would cite a few things. First of all, the language of the squad in US Congress, straight out of the Corbyn playbook. I could almost watch them pick it up and start using that. Secondly, you've also had what Braverman correctly called hate marches in the United States. They've generally been more local, so they haven't been as large as the London March, but then they're more local in a very large country, where not everyone's going to come to a national march and have to fly to Washington, D.C. But I was particularly troubled by what's happening on the US campuses. Not all campuses, but a growing number of campuses. The virulence, the viciousness, the threats and the violence addressed towards Jewish students, sometimes students who are not doing anything about Israel, they're just Jewish students at a Hillel, is worse than anything I ever saw in the UK. And the other thing that worries me deeply is the seeming spinelessness of the campus academic leadership that seems to me to be more interested in caving in to intolerance. Now, when I led our community in the UK, we were pretty much coming to the end of a lot of anti-Israel stuff on campus. And I spent a lot of time talking to university presidents, we call them vice chancellors over here. With one exception, I got a very strongly positive reaction, and they clamped down on expressions of anti-Israel hostility, which crossed the line into anti-Semitism. The IRA working definition, which originated in the United States, was a very, very important tool. But I'm not seeing campus authorities in the United States reacting uniformly in the same way. I have seen clamp down in, I think, 3 campuses of JVP, which is an ugly group. Yeah, and I should say, sorry, the Student Voices for Palestine. But I'm very worried when I see Jewish students in the United States, even in campuses like Connecticut, where they make up 20% of the student body, and they're living in fear.
Yeah.
That needs to be tackled, and tackled strongly. And by the way, although I know it's difficult for Americans to understand a national representative body like the Board of Deputies, this is when we come into our own. Because when I picked up the phone to a vice chancellor, I always was put through because of the brand of the Board of Deputies. And I sometimes think that the American Jewish community, the activist bodies are split between a number of bodies, some of which overlap and some of which take responsibility for different things. I'm not sure it's a strength.
Yeah, good point. Look, let me come back to you in a second on this, but Joe, do you have anything you want to add to what Jonathan just said from your perspective?
Well, I guess, you know, from the perspective of the protests in London, I would just add a couple, I guess you would call them sociological points about what's going on. I think Jonathan is absolutely correct, unfortunately, about a lot of the sinister ideological elements or the environment of anti-Semitism at home or at the mosque, in which a lot of these protesters have been steeping for quite a long time. But frankly, I don't think you can underestimate the extent to which this feels fun to them. And I was really struck by this when I accidentally happened across the fringe of one of the protests at the first weekend of November, because I had to get to a dinner that was sort of around the edge of it. And what I noticed was a lot of young people who had come out with their friends, and there was this strange party atmosphere. And you couple that with the fact that this has happened at around the time where earlier in November, Britain has Guy Fawkes Day, where, a lot of young people will enjoy setting off fireworks with their friends. And I think that it all ended up piggybacking off of that in service of this very sinister message that I think a lot of the people who are organizing this is certainly aware of what they're doing. And then I think that they are preying on the naivete both of people within the Muslim community, especially young people who have not received enough contrary messages about sort of tolerance and sort of respecting your neighbors. They have not received enough of those messages from the schools or other institutions in British life for whatever reason. And so I think that is a factor that's going on here. And then you also, it's important to understand, I mean, going back to what we were saying earlier about the bad media environment on these issues, a big problem is that you have a lot of well-meaning people who are not far left activists and are certainly not Islamists, but they are getting very, very distorted messages from the media and also from other respected institutions like prominent NGOs in British society about what is the right side and the wrong side of this conflict, particularly as Israel's defensive operation in Gaza gathered steam. And so I think that is really contributing in a big way to the problem here. You have this sort of collision of the really troubling elements that, are one kind of problem, and then you have the separate problem of the hangers-on who are in it for a good time or in it because they are trying to do the right thing and have gotten awful messages about how to actually do that. And one needs to be addressing all of these issues in various ways at the same time.
Jonathan, you were mentioning about, let's talk about the police and some of the messages also. You mentioned that some of the signs or some of the, you want to say what you've seen of these pro-Hamas marches in London?
Yes, I haven't been there personally, partly because they've been on Saturdays and partly because I wouldn't go near it because I would fear for my safety. The slogans have been brought to wide public attention, which to my mind is actually a good thing. Everybody who reads any reputable media in the UK now understands that the chant from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, equates to a call for the destruction of the state of Israel. Then there are calls for jihad, which the Metropolitan Police, to my mind, completely inanely said, well, that can have a number of meanings, one of which is a personal crusade to improve your spirituality. To which I say, yeah, right. Then you've got calls on placards or in chants that Israel's guilty of genocide. And then you've got the comparisons with the Nazis. So you've got pictures of Netanyahu with a Hitler moustache, or you've got a swastika somehow entwined with a Star of David. All these examples of either support a blatant anti-Semitism, and then you've got calls for supporting Hamas. Illegal in this country, not I think in the United States, because Hamas is a proscribed terrorist organization, and it is a criminal act to support a terrorist organization in England and Wales, and I think Scotland too, which has its own legal system. So this is what has been profoundly disquieting for the British Jewish community. And as I've written and said on a number of occasions, this is posing a challenge to British society and British institutions. The police, for example, are lagging behind in appreciation and taking effective action by prosecuting. The rates of arrest of demonstrations have been creeping up only because of the outcry that British Jewish community has been raising. The British police generally in London have preferred to stand aside and look the other way because it's easier. And they're short on resources and they don't necessarily want to go into a crowd and pull out agitators, which might mean that individual police officers get hurt. But they are falling down in their job. Editorials in our leading newspapers have said so. The government also needs to respond more strongly to these hate marches, and if necessary, by passing legislation. For example, we've had a number of instances of people climbing on war memorials, waving flags and daubing Free Palestine on the war memorials. Amazingly, it is not completely clear whether such behavior is necessarily illegal. So law often lags behind what happens in society. And this may be one example. But I want to be clear about two things. First of all, this is a challenge to British institutions, and they have to be up to it. Because if they're not up to it, our community says, wait a minute, do we have a future here? And there was a very good editorial, you can see it online, in the Times today, talking about the alarming recrudescence of anti-Semitism. Good word, appropriate word. The second point I want to make it as clearly as I can, and I did a few years ago on one of your webinars, was that I believe Britain is unhappily ahead of the curve on this one. And I see exactly the same trends coming together in the United States, where you also have a growing Muslim population and a growing minority of Muslims. I'm not seeking for one moment, heaven forbid, to accuse the whole of the Muslim population, but a minority of Muslims who are extremists and frankly sympathetic, at least, if not openly supportive, to Hamas. And I also see something I never thought I would see in the United States, and that is a growing left-wing constituency that is not left-wing in the sense of being liberal, democratic, socialist, such as we have in Europe, but left-wing more like the Socialist Workers' Party, which is, frankly, anti-American. And this is another example where, to my mind, you support Israel because it's good for America. You support Israel because it's good for Britain. Because we are seeing, let us make no mistake, we are seeing a challenge to Western democratic liberal values. And our societies have to be up to fighting it.
So I want to get Jonathan before I do. I mean, Joe's in a second, but let me just ask you: there's a lot of anxiety among American Jews today that I don't recall ever, at least in my life. And do you feel safe as a Jew there? You said you didn't want to be near a rally. I don't blame you. Near one of the pro-Hamas rallies. Given how the police have responded. What's your level of?
I feel absolutely safe in Britain. I can walk around every part of London wearing a kippah if I wanted to, and I do not think that I would have any problems whatsoever. Would I go to one of these demonstrations where people are all revved up?
Yeah.
Wearing a kippah or carrying an Israeli flag? No, of course I wouldn't. But that's different. We have some towns in northern England that are majority Muslim. I would feel safe there too. During a spike in violence in the Middle East, emotions run higher. So it is possible that I might expect to get some name calling. Once leaving a demonstration near the Israeli embassy, someone accosted me. Incidentally, he was white British, left wing, I think, called me a baby killer. Not uncommon term of abuse. I just saw on social media 5 minutes before the webinar, a Muslim-looking man on the tube calling some Jewish people coming back from the demonstration, "You're all a load of baby killers." Okay, that's part of their lexicon. But I am not one of those who thinks that we have no future in Britain. I might not be saying the same thing if I lived in Paris. We're only just across the channel, but I believe it's different. I'm confident British Jews have a future. But we have to continue to stand up for ourselves, and we have to point out to sometimes a skeptical government and prosecuting authorities why these things are posing a threat and why they need to act. You're muted, Mike, at the moment.
Thank you again. Joe, let me ask you, how do you, and I, we're not talking about the American Jewish situation here, which I think is also has a lot of anxiety. And I also feel the government here has done a woefully inadequate job of combating anti-Semitism, in my opinion, from the president on down. But do you think, this sacking of Braverman, the Home Secretary, for, I guess, after she wrote this op-ed, I don't know if it was authorized or not, and she's been the one, I think you could address, I think she thought there was a double standard in how the police were dealing with this, if I'm not mistaken, dealing with, the pro-Hamas rallies versus pro-Israel rallies and so on. What did that tell you? Is that just like inside baseball, so to speak, of the Conservative Party, or something's going on that's helpful for us to understand?
I found that situation very difficult to read, because I think that there were two overlapping things going on there. I mean, the inside baseball part of this is that there seems to have been a lot of conflict personality-wise within the cabinet. I think that there were a lot of reports that her colleagues in the cabinet, and particularly Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, had taken umbrage at the fact that she was perceived as not being a team player. I mean, the politics of firing her, if you were to look at it solely from an electoral perspective, doesn't necessarily make a huge amount of sense to me, because she did seem to be reflecting an uneasiness that a substantial part of the Conservative Party electorate, at least, is feeling about the marches and related phenomena. But I also think that the bigger picture here feeds into an observation that Jonathan just made about the policing and the fearfulness of the policing about these protests. I do think that we are realizing belatedly now that core Western values are at stake here. Do we live in societies that understand that you cannot tolerate the sort of anti-Semitic hate that we are seeing on display in the placards or the chants at some of these marches? In Europe, a potent question, which I think that we Americans historically think somewhat different about, concerns this issue of, are European societies going to be capable not only of housing new immigrants who come from very different cultural backgrounds, but of assimilating them, of making sure that they adopt the values that, such as, tolerance, not being hateful, basic stuff like that, that are important to our societies. And I think that kind of conversation is perhaps a bit newer in many parts of Europe than it is in the US, where we've been thinking about assimilating new arrivals basically for centuries. And we have discovered that it has been very difficult for us. So it's also going to be very difficult here. And I think that sort of some of the skittishness about the policing, some of the fretfulness, even that Conservative Party politicians feel with phrases like hate marches, even though it is manifestly accurate. If you look at the messaging coming out of these marches, I think a lot of that reflects the fact that people are still grappling with the core values that are at stake here, and people are struggling to get a grip with how does a society have to act in order to defend what is valuable to that society. What are the legal mechanisms that you need? What are the ways in which the police need to be prepared to act when marches of this sort are happening? And I do think that it is taking a while for British politics, and frankly for the politics in a lot of other European countries, to get a grip on that element of what is going on right now.
I can't remember where I read this, that also questioned the political value of sacking Braverman. I wondered, I think one thing that stuck in me. I watched some video on Twitter or X, whatever, on I think it was Armistice Day, which was over 2 weeks ago. And like here in America, the pro-Hamas rallies are anti-American, anti-Western, just like they're anti-British. But the way they deface, I can't remember some statues or things like that on Armistice Day there, which is the anniversary of the end of World War I. I was wondering, Joe, how you thought that played as you were suggesting with some Tories.
Well, I think we need to explain the Armistice Day and Remembrance Sunday phenomenon to an American audience, because as an American living in the UK, we Americans don't have anything that is quite equivalent to this. It's sort of, I think in terms of the spiritual or civic significance that it has to Brits, it's kind of a cross between the 4th of July and Veterans Day and Thanksgiving. But then also with a highly developed form of civic rituals that go along with this, the sovereign going to the cenotaph, the main war memorial, in the center of the seat of government to lay the wreath, and all of the ceremonial that goes around that. And I think that people understand that this commemoration is a key part of Britishness, this participation in these civic rights, remembering the common history of the world wars. And so it was incredibly provocative for the organizers of the protest to propose any sort of march that weekend that was not related to this civic ritual. And so I think that a lot of then the debate that Suella Braverman got involved in and that ended up engulfing the government was, what was the appropriate way for the government to act in order to defend this core civic ritual that is at the heart of Britain's civic culture. And should that appropriate response have included banning a march that can only have been intended to be provocative because it was scheduled for that day? They didn't want to take the weekend off. And so I think that's the key context. And I sense that this was sometimes confusing to Americans because we do not have an event like that where disrupting it would hit the public consciousness in the way that disrupting the Armistice Day commemoration did here.
All right, we only have a couple minutes left. Jonathan, do you have, and that's what, by the way, and that questions why it seems like Braverman, who seems, was very against these, what she called these hate marches, seem to be that would represent a very popular strain at a minimum among the Tories, let alone across, the greater British electorate. But it sent a signal for the government. Yeah, go ahead, please, Jonathan.
No, I don't think she was sacked because of that view. I think that there was a head of steam building up against her because of her management style. Her successor has said that he would prefer to talk quietly and carry a big stick, which I think is a quote from the American political world, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Teddy Roosevelt, suppose. Yes.
What he was saying very politely, in a typically British understated way, was that his predecessor tended to shout and not follow it up with any action.
Yeah.
And I think that she was viewed by Rishi Sunak, who's no particular political friend of hers, as someone who was becoming a political liability. And when she wrote an article that criticized the police, and the Home Secretary is supposed to have a productive and mutually positive relationship with the police, without getting clearance from number 10 Downing Street first, because the British Political Convention is that a minister does not deliver a major policy statement without clearance from the Prime Minister's office. I think that was the last straw that broke the camel's back. And that's why she was sacked, not, I think, because she said anything which the government particularly disagreed with over Gaza.
But do you think, just on the last point, and either Jonathan, Joe, do you think that, okay, so maybe they've been quieter, but are they carrying a bigger stick in addressing these hate marches?
I think that the problem they're going to run into is that they are probably going to need to both speak loudly and carry the big stick at the same time, because I think that part of what they have to do, which is where I think Braverman was potentially very effective, is the public persuasion. And I mean, one problem that increasingly is bothering me about the situation with the marches every weekend is, I mean, the first weekend that it happened, I mean, you could have predicted that it was going to end up the way it was if you follow these issues. If you want to be more generous than they deserve, you can argue that perhaps that first weekend there were a lot of people there who would not have expected the kind of anti-Semitic chanting or placards or the like that they saw, but that has continued to happen. So anyone who has showed up since then knew that that was what they were affiliating themselves with. And yet there's this tendency to talk about the peaceful part of the protest versus the problematic part, or suggesting that there's a small element that is a problem. And in one sense, that's true, but I think that it is an example of how you have to be prepared to make the bigger point that people have to be aware of what they are participating in with these things. And I think that the government is going to have to be prepared to be very aggressive with that kind of messaging, especially because they are often going to have to cut through a media that will be hemming and hawing a bit about it.
Okay. I guess I'll tell you what, we got one more minute left. Jonathan, do you want to have the final word?
I agree, and would add that a left-wing activist called Peter Tatchell, no friend of Israel, turned up at the march a week ago carrying a placard which said "Ceasefire now" and "Free the hostages." He was thrown out the march.
Yeah.
The point that we need to make over and over again to the British public is that at these marches, you do not hear any criticism of what Hamas did on October 7th. You do not hear any calls for peace with Israel.
Hello?
You do not hear any calls for concern
Yes.
for people in Israel.
Good.
Bereaved.
We are finishing up the webinar. Could you call me back in about 5 minutes?
Ethan, please mute your phone. Good. Sorry, Jonathan, finish. Yeah.
No, and this is what is troubling. I'm not suggesting we can pass laws overnight that are going to ban these marches. I'm not sure I'm in favor of banning marches because we believe in free speech.
Yeah.
And I think one good thing these marches have done is bring home to the British people how ugly the people behind the march. It's not the useful idiots, if you want to call them that, who come on the marches because they're concerned about death of children in Gaza. The people who organized the marches, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, the Socialist Workers' Party, Stop the War, these are people who believe in the destruction of the state of Israel. And that's what's got to be exposed and exposed and exposed. And the polling has shown that most British people reject that message.
Look, I haven't seen. I'd love if somebody of our audience would send me. I haven't seen any march that's allegedly pro-Palestinian, and I say allegedly pro-Palestinian because I haven't seen any march that has been supportive of the Palestinian cause, which I could understand, but criticizes Hamas at all, anything. So it seems like these movements, Hamas is the Palestinian cause. As you point out, I haven't seen anything that says free the hostages and pro ceasefire at all, and it's very disturbing. There was just, I think, a few days ago, maybe some of you saw it, 2 Palestinians in the West Bank seemed to be killed by Hamas. They were ripped up. Their bodies were, I think, mutilated. They were hung up on a electric pole. I don't remember anybody. No, I haven't seen any criticism of that because they were killed by Palestinians, not by Israel. So, yeah. But anyhow.
Similarly,
yeah.
maybe I'll just close with this. 1 million Syrians, including quite a lot of Palestinians, were killed by Bashar Assad.
Yeah, we haven't seen
I didn't see any marches on the street.
No, either did I.
Well, and I will just add, no one ever protests closer British business relationships with China, despite the oppression of the Uyghur Muslims.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, that would be something that would be worth protesting if people wanted to do something useful with their time here.
Yeah. Yeah, I've asked an ambassador of a Muslim country here in Washington about that. How come they're not vocal? Seems like American government is much more critical than a lot of Muslim governments are about what's happening to the terrible things happening to the Muslim Uyghurs in China. Look, I know we could keep going on. I want to thank you two both very much for taking the time with sharing your thoughts about what's going on in Britain. Obviously, I know you guys are in London, but I'm sure at least you know, Joe, that obviously folks care very much here what's going on. And I think your warnings, Jonathan, about the similarities or what happens in London, that things seem to premiere in London and then come to America next, is something all American Jews need to be very conscious of. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank the audience for joining us for this past hour, and I wish you rest a good day. And please be tuned in to future GINSA webinars as we continue to cover this conflict and related matters very closely. Thank you very much. Bye.